June 15, 1941. Tokyo, Japan. German Embassy District. Richard Sorge sat at his typewriter in his modest apartment 3 blocks from the German embassy, his hands trembling slightly as he encrypted the most important message of his espionage career. Outside, the humid Tokyo evening pressed against his windows, the city's lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over the Japanese capital. Inside, Sorge worked with the methodical precision that had made him the Soviet Union's most valuable intelligence asset, encoding information that would, if anyone in Moscow actually listened, prevent the greatest military disaster in Russian history. What Sorge was about to transmit to Moscow would be his 84th warning about the coming German invasion of the Soviet Union. This one was different from all the previous reports because this one contained the exact date, the precise hour, and the detailed operational plans for Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's plan to destroy the Soviet Union in a single devastating campaign. The information was irrefutable, verified through multiple independent sources, confirmed by documents Sorge had personally photographed in the German ambassador's office. What Richard Sorge could not know, what would have broken his heart if he had understood it, was that his perfect intelligence would be systematically ignored, dismissed as British provocation, and filed away unread. That Joseph Stalin, the man Sorge served with absolute loyalty despite never having met him, would call him a little shit who has set himself up with some small factories and brothels in Japan. That the Soviet dictator would trust Adolf Hitler's word more than the carefully gathered intelligence from his own master spy. And that this willful blindness would cost the Soviet Union 4-5 million casualties in the first 6 months of war, would bring the Wehrmacht to the gates of Moscow, would nearly destroy the Red Army completely, and would make Operation Barbarossa the most successful surprise attack in military history despite being the most predicted, most warned about, most thoroughly reported military operation ever planned. Richard Sorge's journey to this moment began not in Moscow or Tokyo, but in Baku, Azerbaijan, where he was born in 1895 to a German petroleum engineer and a Russian mother. This mixed heritage would prove crucial to his later espionage career, giving him natural facility with both German and Russian languages and cultural understanding of both nations. But it was World War I that truly shaped the man who would become the Soviet Union's greatest spy. Sorge served in the German army during the Great War, fighting on the Western Front with the idealistic fervor of young men who believed in honor, duty, and national glory. The reality of industrial warfare, the mud, the poison gas, the senseless slaughter, the incompetent generals sending millions to die for yards of worthless ground, destroyed those illusions completely. Seriously wounded in 1916, Sorge spent months recovering in military hospitals, reading voraciously, questioning everything he had believed about nationalism, capitalism, and the social order that had produced such catastrophic waste of human life. He emerged from the war a convinced Marxist, believing that only communist revolution could prevent future wars by eliminating the capitalist competition that drove nations to conflict. He joined the German Communist Party in 1919, earned a doctorate in political science in 1920, and became increasingly involved in Comintern activities, the international communist organization coordinating revolutionary movements worldwide. By 1924, Soviet intelligence had recruited Sorge for the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, recognizing in him a rare combination of intellectual brilliance, ideological commitment, language skills, and personal courage. His German background provided perfect cover for operating in countries where Soviet citizens would be immediately suspect. His academic credentials gave him access to circles where state secrets were discussed. And his genuine belief in the communist cause made him immune to the money or blackmail that compromised lesser agents. Sorge's first major assignment sent him to China in 1930, where he established himself as a German journalist covering the political and military situation. He developed sources in the German military mission advising Chinese nationalist forces, obtained information about Japanese military activities in Manchuria, and proved himself so valuable that GRU headquarters selected him for the most important intelligence assignment of the era, penetrating German and Japanese leadership circles in Tokyo to assess their war plans and capabilities. He arrived in Japan in September 1933, armed with genuine credentials as a correspondent for major German newspapers. His cover was perfect because it was essentially true. He was a German journalist, and his articles published in respected German newspapers were actually well-researched and well-written pieces that enhanced his reputation rather than compromising it. But Sorge's genius lay not in his cover story, but in his ability to build an intelligence network of extraordinary breadth and penetration. Within months of arriving in Tokyo, he had cultivated a close friendship with Huguenot, the German military attaché who would later become German ambassador to Japan. Ott, a lonely man far from home, found in Sorge an intelligent, well-educated German who shared his language and culture. They drank together, discussed politics and military affairs, became genuine friends. When Ott was appointed ambassador in 1938, he invited Sorge to use an office in the German embassy, gave him access to classified communications, and discussed sensitive diplomatic and military matters with him as a trusted confidant. It was the perfect espionage scenario. The spy welcomed into the very heart of the organization he was penetrating, trusted completely, given access to secrets that other spies spent careers trying to obtain. But Sorge didn't depend solely on his German sources. He simultaneously built a parallel network among Japanese contacts, most importantly Ozaki Hatsumi, a respected Japanese journalist and intellectual with access to the highest levels of Japanese government. Ozaki, a secret communist sympathizer, provided Sorge with detailed information about Japanese military planning, political decision-making, and economic capacity. Together, Sorge and Ozaki created an intelligence network that gave Moscow unprecedented access to both German and Japanese strategic planning. They knew about the Anti-Comintern Pact before it was signed. They reported on German-Japanese military cooperation. They tracked Japanese military operations in China. They provided detailed analysis of Japanese industrial capacity and military readiness. And in early 1941, as Hitler's Germany began massing troops on the Soviet border, they started reporting the most important intelligence of the war. Germany was planning to invade the Soviet Union, and Japan had decided not to join the attack. The first warnings about German preparations for invading the Soviet Union reached Moscow in January 1941 from multiple sources, not just Sorge. Soviet intelligence was actually quite effective, with networks operating throughout Europe providing high-quality information. Reports came from the Red Orchestra, spy ring in Germany, from Soviet agents in Britain and Switzerland, from military intelligence officers analyzing German troop movements, from diplomatic sources observing German diplomatic activity. All these sources reported the same basic pattern. Germany was moving troops east, concentrating forces along the Soviet border, stockpiling supplies, conducting reconnaissance of border defenses, and preparing for major military operations. The evidence was overwhelming, consistent across independent sources, and pointed to only one conclusion: Germany was preparing to break the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact and invade the Soviet Union. Stalin's reaction to this intelligence was not mere skepticism but active, angry rejection. He had multiple reasons, both strategic and psychological, for refusing to believe that Germany would attack. The Nazi-Soviet pact signed in August 1939 had been Stalin's diplomatic masterpiece, or so he believed. The agreement had allowed Germany to invade Poland without Soviet interference, had divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, and had given Stalin time to build up Soviet military forces while Germany was occupied fighting Britain and France. Stalin had convinced himself that Hitler was a rational actor who would not make the suicidal mistake of fighting a two-front war. Germany was still fighting Britain. The Wehrmacht was stretched across occupied Europe from Norway to Greece. German industry was producing weapons at maximum capacity just to sustain current operations. Opening a second front against the Soviet Union would be military insanity, and whatever else Hitler was, he was not militarily stupid. Therefore, Stalin reasoned, the intelligence reports must be wrong. Not just mistaken, but deliberately false, part of a British intelligence operation designed to provoke conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. Britain, fighting alone after the fall of France, desperately needed someone else to fight Germany. What better way to achieve this than to manufacture intelligence suggesting German invasion plans, hoping to trigger Soviet preemptive actions that would push Germany and the USSR into war. This wasn't paranoid fantasy. It was, from Stalin's perspective, logical analysis of British strategic interests. The problem was that it was completely wrong, a catastrophic misreading of reality driven by Stalin's need to believe that his diplomatic achievement, the Nazi-Soviet pact, would hold. General Philip Golikov, head of GRU military intelligence, personally briefed Stalin on the incoming intelligence reports throughout early 1941. Golikov compiled the information carefully, summarizing reports from multiple sources, noting the consistency across independent intelligence channels, presenting the evidence that Germany was preparing for invasion. Stalin's reaction was dismissive and angry. He accused his intelligence services of being duped by British disinformation. He questioned the loyalty of officers who brought him such reports, implying they might be traitors trying to provoke war with Germany. He ordered GRU and NKVD to stop sending reports about German invasion preparations unless they had absolute proof of Hitler's personal decision to attack. This order had a chilling effect on Soviet intelligence reporting. Officers who had risked their lives gathering information now faced the choice of reporting what they knew and being accused of disloyalty, or remaining silent and failing in their duty. Many chose silence. Others softened their reports, burying unwelcome conclusions in bureaucratic language, hoping someone higher up would see the truth without blaming the messenger. But some officers continued reporting honestly, knowing they might be punished for telling the truth. Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, received intelligence reports from naval attaches in Berlin and other European capitals confirming German preparations. He brought these reports to Stalin personally, arguing that the Navy should begin war preparations immediately. Stalin's response was brutal. "You've got yourselves worked up over this nonsense. Germany is not ready to fight us. She is afraid of us. And anyone who attacks us will be beaten so badly that he'll regret it." When Kuznetsov persisted, Stalin grew angrier. "Did you come here to scare us with the Germans, or do you want to prepare us for war with Germany? If that's so, you can leave now." Kuznetsov left the meeting shaken but unconvinced. He returned to Navy headquarters and, on his own authority, began placing the Soviet Navy on heightened alert, moving submarines to patrol positions, preparing surface vessels for combat operations, and stockpiling ammunition and fuel. When war came, the Soviet Navy would be the only branch of the Red Army that was actually prepared, and it was because one admiral had the courage to disobey Stalin's orders. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Richard Sorge continued sending increasingly urgent reports to Moscow through his radio operator, Max Clausen. The messages were encrypted using one-time pads, transmitted in Morse code to Soviet receiving stations, then forwarded to GRU headquarters in Moscow. Each message was numbered, logged, and theoretically read by analysts who would assess its importance and forward critical intelligence to higher authority. Throughout March, April, and May 1941, Sorge sent detailed reports about German military preparations. He provided information from conversations with Ambassador Ott, who discussed Germany's frustration with the war against Britain and the need to secure resources in the East. He reported on meetings at the German embassy where military attaches discussed troop movements and logistics requirements. He forwarded documents that Ozaki had obtained showing Japanese assessments of German military strength. And he sent specific tactical intelligence. German forces were concentrating in 3 major army groups: Army Group North targeting Leningrad, Army Group Center targeting Moscow, Army Group South targeting Ukraine. The attack would begin in late June, during the period of longest daylight in northern latitudes. The Germans expected to destroy the Red Army in 6 weeks through rapid armored thrusts that would encircle Soviet forces before they could retreat. On May 15, 1941, Sorge sent a message that should have triggered immediate Soviet war preparations. "German military advisors in Tokyo have received orders to return to Germany by May 20th. War will begin in late June." The recall of military advisors was standard German procedure before major operations. Get your people out of potential enemy countries before starting a war that would make them enemy aliens subject to internment. Moscow acknowledged receipt of Sorge's message. It was logged, filed, and ignored. On June 1st, Sorge obtained even more specific information. A German transport officer, drunk at an embassy party, complained to Sorge about the logistical nightmare of supplying 3 million men advancing hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. He mentioned the operational date, June 22. Sorge immediately encrypted this information and transmitted to Moscow. German invasion will begin on June 22, 1941. 9 armies totaling 150 divisions will attack. This was the 82nd warning Soviet intelligence received about the coming German invasion. It was the most specific, giving the exact date 3 weeks in advance. It came from a proven source whose previous intelligence had always been accurate. It confirmed reports from other sources who were also indicating late June as the invasion date. Stalin's reaction, when informed of Sorge's latest message, was contemptuous. He told his staff that Sorge was clearly a British agent or a fool, spreading disinformation to provoke Soviet-German conflict. "There's this bastard," Stalin reportedly said, "who has set himself up with some small factories and brothels in Japan and even deigned to report the date of the attack as June 22. Are you suggesting I should believe him too?" The characterization of Sorge as running small factories and brothels was completely false. Sorge ran no businesses at all, and his lifestyle, while comfortable, was funded by GRU payments through a carefully constructed cover system. But Stalin needed to dismiss Sorge's credibility, and personal insults served that purpose. On June 11, 11 days before the invasion, Sorge sent his final warning. "Invasion absolutely certain. Date, June 22. Request immediate acknowledgement." Moscow acknowledged receipt but sent no follow-up questions, no requests for additional details, no indication that anyone was taking the warning seriously. Other intelligence sources sent similar warnings. Winston Churchill, receiving reports from British intelligence about German preparations, personally sent a message to Stalin through diplomatic channels warning of the coming attack. Stalin dismissed this as obvious British manipulation. The U.S. State Department, analyzing German diplomatic communications, concluded that invasion was imminent and passed this assessment to Soviet representatives in Washington. Stalin dismissed American intelligence as even less reliable than British. Soviet border troops reported massive German buildups across the entire frontier, photographed German reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory, observed German engineering units building bridges and preparing roads for tank movements. These tactical observations were forwarded up the chain of command, where they were suppressed by officers afraid of Stalin's anger. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Military District directly in the path of Army Group Center's planned attack, requested permission to move his forces to defensive positions, to call up reserves, to begin combat preparations. Stalin denied these requests, accusing Pavlov of warmongering and trying to provoke Germany. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, chief of the General Staff, presented Stalin with a comprehensive intelligence assessment on June 13 showing that German forces were ready to attack and that Soviet forces needed immediate mobilization. Stalin exploded in rage, accusing Zhukov of panic and demanding to know why everyone was trying to provoke war with Germany. The surreal nature of the situation cannot be overstated. The Soviet Union possessed the most accurate, most comprehensive, most detailed intelligence about enemy intentions that any nation had ever obtained before war, and the nation's leader was systematically rejecting all of it based on his personal conviction that it must be wrong. On June 21, 1941, the day before the invasion, a German deserter crossed the Soviet lines and told his captors that the attack would begin at dawn the next morning. He provided details of his unit's attack plan, the jump-off positions, the objectives for the first day. Soviet officers rushed this information to Moscow, where it joined 83 previous warnings in files that Stalin refused to read. That night, Stalin went to bed at his dacha outside Moscow, confident that his diplomatic genius had secured peace with Germany, convinced that his intelligence services were incompetent or disloyal, and certain that anyone warning of German invasion was either a fool or a traitor. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire across the entire Soviet frontier from the Baltic to the Black Sea. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 3,600 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, and 7,000 artillery pieces, began advancing into Soviet territory along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. The Red Army, caught completely unprepared despite 84 specific warnings, was destroyed piecemeal in the greatest military catastrophe in modern history. Richard Sorge had been exactly right. And it had made no difference whatsoever. June 22, 1941. 3:15 a.m. Soviet-German border. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Barbarossa was heard across hundreds of miles of frontier, a rolling thunder that woke millions of Soviet soldiers who had gone to sleep in peacetime and would wake to find themselves at war. 3 million German soldiers began advancing along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history, and they were attacking an enemy who had been warned 84 times that this exact attack was coming. The Red Army's response to the invasion was chaos and catastrophe on a scale difficult to comprehend. Soviet forces were not mobilized, not deployed in defensive positions, not prepared for combat. Ammunition was stored in central depots far from frontline units. Artillery pieces lacked crews or ammunition. Tank units had vehicles but no fuel. Infantry divisions were scattered across their districts in summer training camps. Air Force units had their aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields, perfect targets for German strikes. The Soviet Air Force was destroyed in the first day of fighting. German aircraft struck Soviet airfields at dawn, catching hundreds of planes on the ground. By nightfall on June 22, the Red Army had lost approximately 1,200 aircraft, most destroyed on the ground without ever taking off. Entire air regiments were annihilated before their pilots could reach their planes. The Luftwaffe achieved immediate air superiority that would persist for months. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Military District directly in the path of Army Group Center, watched his command disintegrate within hours. The Germans had concentrated massive armored forces for breakthrough operations, exactly as intelligence reports had predicted. Pavlov's forces, spread across their peacetime positions, were encircled and destroyed in detail. Communications collapsed immediately as German strikes severed telephone lines and Soviet radio discipline proved inadequate. Pavlov tried frantically to organize counterattacks, to establish defensive lines, to coordinate his scattered forces. But he was attempting to conduct mobile defense with an army that was neither mobilized nor deployed properly. His tanks had no fuel. His artillery had no ammunition nearby. His infantry divisions were separated from their heavy equipment. Within 3 days, Pavlov's Western Front had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent military force. Stalin's reaction to news of the invasion was initially disbelief, then panic, then rage. When informed at dawn that German forces were attacking across the entire frontier, Stalin reportedly said, "Surely the German generals have started this without Hitler's knowledge." He clung desperately to the belief that this must be an unauthorized provocation by rogue German commanders, that Hitler would stop the attack once he learned of it, that the Nazi-Soviet pact still held. Only when German bombers struck Soviet cities, when Hitler's declaration of war was broadcast on German radio, when the scale of the attack became undeniable, did Stalin accept that he had been catastrophically wrong. The intelligence services had been right. The warnings had been accurate. And his refusal to believe them had destroyed the Red Army. Stalin disappeared from public view for the next 11 days, either suffering a nervous breakdown or deliberately withdrawing to avoid blame. Soviet government operations nearly collapsed without his direction. Military commanders received contradictory orders or no orders at all. The Red Army fought desperately but without coordination, each unit making independent decisions about whether to stand and fight or retreat. General Georgy Zhukov, chief of the General Staff, tried to coordinate Soviet responses from Moscow, but he was attempting to command forces that no longer existed as organized units. Army Group Center advanced 200 miles in the first week, encircling Soviet forces in massive pockets. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group South pushed into Ukraine. The German advance proceeded almost exactly as the intelligence reports had predicted it would. The human cost of Stalin's refusal to believe the warnings became apparent within days. Soviet casualties in the first week exceeded 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions surrendered or were destroyed. The Germans captured so many prisoners, hundreds of thousands in the first month, that they lacked facilities to hold them all. Soviet POWs were herded into open fields surrounded by barbed wire, left without food or shelter, dying by thousands from starvation and exposure. By July 1st, 9 days after the invasion began, the Germans had advanced 300 miles on some sectors of the front, destroyed or captured thousands of Soviet tanks and aircraft, and killed or captured over 750,000 Red Army soldiers. The scale of the disaster exceeded any previous military defeat in history. And it was entirely preventable. Admiral Kuznetsov's decision to prepare the Soviet Navy on his own authority proved vindicated. The Baltic and Black Sea fleets were alert when war began, engaged German naval forces immediately, and performed far better than the Army or Air Force. Kuznetsov had risked his career and possibly his life by disobeying Stalin's orders not to prepare for war. His courage saved the Soviet Navy from the catastrophe that destroyed the other services. But Kuznetsov could not save the army. General Pavlov, who had requested permission to mobilize and been denied, who had warned of the coming attack and been accused of warmongering, who had tried to prepare his forces within the constraints Stalin imposed, was arrested on June 28. He was brought to Moscow, interrogated, accused of treason and cowardice, and executed by firing squad on July 22. Pavlov's execution was manifestly unjust. He had been proven correct in his warnings and had fought as effectively as anyone could have under impossible circumstances. But Stalin needed scapegoats for the catastrophe his own decisions had caused. Blaming and executing subordinates served multiple purposes. It deflected responsibility from Stalin's failures, it terrorized other commanders into fighting desperately rather than retreating, and it maintained Stalin's image as infallible leader whose subordinates had betrayed him. The executed generals included not just Pavlov but also his chief of staff, his communications chief, and his Air Force commander. All had warned of the coming attack. All had requested permission to prepare. All had been denied and then blamed for the consequences. The message to surviving Soviet commanders was clear: retreat or defeat meant execution, regardless of circumstances. Marshal Zhukov, who had presented comprehensive intelligence assessments before the war and been accused of warmongering, somehow survived Stalin's purge. Perhaps Stalin recognized that Zhukov's competence was too valuable to waste. Perhaps Zhukov's blunt honesty actually earned Stalin's grudging respect. Whatever the reason, Zhukov remained in command and would eventually become the Soviet Union's most important military leader. By August 1941, 2 months after the invasion, Soviet casualties exceeded 2.5 million men. The Germans had captured Smolensk, were approaching Leningrad, and were driving deep into Ukraine. The Red Army had lost approximately 10,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, and vast quantities of artillery and equipment. Germany appeared to be winning the war exactly as Hitler had predicted, destroying the Soviet Union in a single devastating campaign. The intelligence reports that had warned of all this sat in Moscow files, ignored and unread. Richard Sorge's 84 warnings had been accurate in every detail. The date was correct. The force composition was correct. The operational plan was correct. The German objectives were correct. Everything Sorge reported proved true. And it had made no difference because Stalin refused to believe it. In Tokyo, Sorge continued his intelligence work, unaware of the catastrophe his warnings had failed to prevent. He sent additional reports throughout the summer of 1941, including critically important intelligence that Japan had decided not to attack the Soviet Union from the east. This information, which Stalin did believe because it aligned with his preferences, allowed the USSR to transfer Siberian divisions westward to defend Moscow. But by October 1941, Japanese counterintelligence had identified Sorge's network through radio direction finding and surveillance of suspected communist sympathizers. On October 18, 1941, Japanese police arrested Sorge, Ozaki Hatsumi, and other network members. The most successful spy ring of World War II was rolled up completely. Sorge's interrogation by Japanese authorities was professional and thorough. He maintained his cover initially but eventually admitted his Soviet intelligence work when presented with overwhelming evidence. He provided extensive details about his intelligence methods, his sources, and his operational techniques. He cooperated fully, perhaps hoping that his cooperation might lead to prisoner exchange. The Soviet Union made no effort whatsoever to secure Sorge's release. Stalin, informed that his master spy had been captured, showed no interest in arranging an exchange. Moscow never acknowledged Sorge's service or admitted he was a Soviet agent. He was simply abandoned, left to face Japanese justice alone. Sorge and Ozaki were tried, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to death. They spent 3 years in Japanese prisons awaiting execution, while their lawyers filed appeals that were systematically rejected. On November 7, 1944, Richard Sorge was hanged in Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. His last words were reportedly, "The Soviet Union, the Comintern, and the Soviet people, hurrah!" He died believing in the cause he had served, never knowing that Stalin had called him a little shit, never knowing that his perfect intelligence had been dismissed and ignored, never knowing that his warnings might have prevented the deaths of millions if anyone in Moscow had listened. The final casualty count of Operation Barbarossa's first 6 months tells the story of what Stalin's refusal to believe intelligence cost the Soviet Union: 4.5 million Red Army soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies destroyed. Thousands of tanks and aircraft lost. Millions of Soviet citizens dead or enslaved. The German Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. All of this was predicted, warned about, and documented by Soviet intelligence services months before it happened. Richard Sorge alone sent 84 warnings. Other sources sent dozens more. The exact date was known weeks in advance. The German order of battle was accurately reported. The operational plan was obtained and transmitted. And none of it mattered because Joseph Stalin refused to believe what his intelligence services told him. December 5, 1941. The outskirts of Moscow. German forces had reached the suburbs of the Soviet capital, close enough that Wehrmacht officers could see the Kremlin spires through their binoculars. Army Group Center had advanced over 600 miles from the Soviet border in 6 months of nearly uninterrupted victory, destroying Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners, and conquering territory larger than France and Germany combined. The Third Reich appeared on the verge of its greatest triumph, the capture of Moscow and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then the Red Army counterattacked, and everything changed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had prepared this counteroffensive carefully, husbanding reserves that Stalin had finally allowed him to accumulate. Most critically, Zhukov had transferred 40 fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, well-trained and well-equipped forces that had been guarding against possible Japanese attack. These transfers were possible only because Soviet intelligence, specifically Richard Sorge's reporting from Tokyo, had confirmed that Japan would not attack the USSR but would instead strike south against American and British possessions in the Pacific. This was the terrible irony of Stalin's selective trust in intelligence. He had dismissed Sorge's 84 warnings about German invasion because they contradicted what Stalin wanted to believe. But he accepted Sorge's intelligence about Japanese intentions because it aligned with his strategic preferences. One piece of intelligence from Sorge was ignored at catastrophic cost. Another piece was believed and helped save Moscow. The Soviet counteroffensive drove German forces back from Moscow's outskirts, inflicting Germany's first major defeat of World War II. The Wehrmacht retreated in chaos, abandoning equipment, suffering terrible casualties from cold and combat. Hitler's plan for quick victory had failed. Germany now faced exactly what Hitler had sworn to avoid: a prolonged two-front war of attrition. The Battle of Moscow vindicated those Soviet commanders who had warned that Germany could be defeated if the USSR survived the initial onslaught. Zhukov, who had presented intelligence assessments before the war and been accused of warmongering, was proven right. Admiral Kuznetsov, who had prepared the navy despite Stalin's orders, was proven right. Even General Pavlov, already executed for cowardice and treason, was posthumously proven right. He had warned the attack was coming and requested permission to prepare defenses. But vindication came too late for the millions who had died because Stalin refused to believe accurate intelligence. The Red Army that stopped the Germans at Moscow was not the army that existed in June 1941. That army had been destroyed almost completely. The force defending Moscow in December consisted largely of hastily trained replacements, factory workers mobilized directly into military units, survivors from encircled formations who had fought their way back to Soviet lines, and the Siberian divisions whose transfer Sorge's intelligence had enabled. Soviet casualties by the end of 1941 exceeded 6 million killed, wounded, or captured. The number was so staggering that Soviet authorities suppressed it even from their own military leadership. Stalin could not acknowledge that his decisions had cost 6 million Soviet soldiers in 6 months. The narrative instead emphasized German brutality, Soviet heroic resistance, and inevitable ultimate victory. The intelligence failures that made the catastrophe possible were never officially acknowledged. Stalin's treatment of his intelligence services after Operation Barbarossa combined grudging recognition that they had been right with refusal to admit his own error. General Golikov, head of GRU, was removed from intelligence work and given field commands where his competence could be useful without his accurate pre-war assessments being remembered. Officers who had provided accurate warnings were either punished nor promoted. They were simply transferred to positions where their inconvenient accuracy could be forgotten. The one exception was Admiral Kuznetsov, whose insubordination in preparing the Navy was too successful to punish. Kuznetsov remained as Navy commander throughout the war, his early warning preparations cited as an example of proper vigilance. But Kuznetsov's memoirs, written decades later, make clear he never forgot that he had disobeyed direct orders from Stalin and that his disobedience had been necessary because Stalin was catastrophically wrong. Richard Sorge's fate remained unknown in the Soviet Union for years. Moscow had never acknowledged his existence as a Soviet agent. His network was never officially recognized. His warnings were never officially recorded in any public accounting of the war's beginning. When Japanese authorities announced his execution in 1944, Soviet media did not report it. Sorge simply disappeared from history, an unperson whose service was denied. This denial continued for 2 decades after the war. Soviet veterans returning from Japanese captivity reported that they had heard of Sorge during their imprisonment, that Japanese guards had mentioned the famous Soviet spy. These reports reached Soviet intelligence services but were not acted upon. Stalin, still alive until 1953, would never admit that Sorge had been right and that he, Stalin, had been wrong. Only after Stalin's death did the Soviet government begin reconsidering Sorge's case. In 1964, 20 years after his execution, the USSR finally acknowledged Richard Sorge as a Soviet intelligence officer. He was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. Streets were named after him. Monuments were erected. His face appeared on Soviet postage stamps. But this belated recognition came with careful omissions. Official Soviet accounts emphasized Sorge's intelligence about Japanese intentions, which had helped save Moscow. They mentioned his warnings about German invasion only briefly, without dwelling on the fact that these warnings had been ignored. The narrative suggested Sorge's intelligence had been valuable and appreciated, carefully avoiding the truth that Stalin had dismissed him as a little shit, running brothels in Japan. The actual documents, Stalin's dismissive comments, the filed and ignored intelligence reports, the requests for war preparations that were denied, remained classified in Soviet archives. The full extent of the intelligence failure was known to historians and senior officials but was not publicly discussed. Admitting that the Soviet Union had possessed perfect intelligence about Operation Barbarossa and that Stalin had ignored it would have undermined the carefully constructed mythology of Stalin as brilliant wartime leader. Alexis von Wren, the German intelligence officer who had tried to warn Hitler about American industrial superiority, had been executed in October 1944 for peripheral involvement in the July plot against Hitler. Von Wren and Sorge never met, operated for opposing sides, and died within weeks of each other. But they shared a common tragedy, Both were professional intelligence officers who provided accurate assessments to leaders who refused to believe unwelcome truths. The parallel failures of German and Soviet leadership to accept accurate intelligence reveal something fundamental about authoritarian systems. In both Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union, intelligence services could gather excellent information. Both nations had skilled analysts, effective spy networks, and sophisticated collection methods. The failure was not in gathering or analyzing intelligence. The failure was in leadership's willingness to accept information that contradicted their predetermined beliefs. Hitler refused to believe German analysts who calculated that America's industrial capacity made German victory impossible. Stalin refused to believe Soviet intelligence that Germany would invade despite the Nazi-Soviet pact. In both cases, ideology and personal conviction trumped empirical evidence. In both cases, millions paid the price for their leaders' willful blindness. The post-war Soviet Union eventually compiled comprehensive studies of the intelligence failures preceding Operation Barbarossa. These classified analyses documented the 80-plus warnings from multiple sources, analyzed why the warnings were dismissed, and examined the catastrophic consequences. The studies concluded that the Red Army's unpreparedness was not due to intelligence failure but to leadership's refusal to act on accurate intelligence. These studies remained classified until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Only then did historians gain access to the full documentation of how thoroughly Soviet intelligence had warned of the coming invasion, and how completely those warnings had been ignored. The archives revealed Stalin's dismissive comments about Sorge, his accusations against officers who warned of invasion, his orders preventing military preparations, and his paranoid certainty that warnings were British provocations. The human cost of Stalin's decisions can never be fully calculated. The 6 million Red Army casualties in 1941 represent only military losses. Civilian casualties were equally horrific: millions of Soviet citizens killed, millions more enslaved or deported by German occupation forces. Cities were destroyed, industries dismantled, populations devastated. The Soviet Union suffered more than any other nation in World War II, with total war deaths exceeding 27 million. How many of these deaths were preventable? If Stalin had believed the intelligence and properly prepared Soviet defenses, would the initial German advance have been stopped? Could the Red Army have prevented the encirclements that led to millions of prisoners? Might proper preparation have shortened the war by months or years? These questions cannot be answered definitively, but military historians generally agree that Soviet unpreparedness significantly worsened the initial disasters. The Red Army in June 1941 had sufficient forces, equipment, and defensive terrain to make German victory much more difficult if those forces had been properly deployed and supplied. Stalin's refusal to mobilize gave Germany advantages that transformed a difficult campaign into a catastrophic rout. Richard Sorge's vindication came too late for him personally but established his reputation as one of history's most successful intelligence officers. Modern intelligence services study his methods, his network building, his source cultivation. His ability to penetrate both German and Japanese leadership circles simultaneously remains extraordinary. His reporting was accurate, timely, and comprehensive, everything intelligence professionals aspire to provide. But Sorge's story is also studied as a cautionary tale about the limits of intelligence. Perfect information is worthless if decision-makers refuse to believe it. Comprehensive warnings mean nothing if leaders dismiss them as propaganda. The most successful spy network in history failed to prevent catastrophe because one man, Joseph Stalin, refused to accept reality. The lesson transcends World War II and remains relevant for understanding intelligence failures in any era. Gathering information is the easy part. The hard part is ensuring that accurate intelligence reaches decision-makers who will actually use it to inform their choices rather than dismiss it when it contradicts their preconceptions. The story of Richard Sorge and Operation Barbarossa's intelligence failures contains lessons that extend far beyond World War II, revealing timeless truths about the relationship between information, power, and decision-making in warfare and statecraft. The most fundamental lesson is the distinction between intelligence and wisdom. Sorge provided perfect intelligence, accurate information about enemy intentions, capabilities, and plans. But intelligence becomes wisdom only when leaders accept it, understand its implications, and act accordingly. Stalin possessed the intelligence but lacked the wisdom to believe it. This failure transformed information that should have prevented catastrophe into useless data filed away in archives. The term, intelligence failure, is actually a misnomer for what happened in June 1941. Soviet intelligence succeeded brilliantly. The failure was Stalin's refusal to accept what his intelligence services told him. Confirmation bias led Stalin to believe intelligence suggesting Japan would not attack while dismissing intelligence about German invasion. His commitment to the Nazi-Soviet pact blinded him to evidence that Hitler would break it. The execution of General Pavlov while Admiral Kuznetsov survived despite both disobeying orders reveals the perverse incentives in authoritarian systems. Pavlov had asked permission to prepare, been denied, and then been blamed when unpreparedness led to disaster. Kuznetsov had prepared without permission, succeeded, and been vindicated. The difference was outcome. Success protected Kuznetsov while failure doomed Pavlov, even though Pavlov's failure was caused by following Stalin's orders. Richard Sorge's personal tragedy was dying for a cause that had abandoned him. He remained ideologically committed to Soviet communism even as Stalin's regime proved the hollowness of its ideals. Sorge served loyally, risked his life repeatedly, and provided intelligence that should have saved millions of lives. His reward was dismissal as a little shit and abandonment when captured. Yet his last words praised the Soviet Union. This loyalty despite betrayal remains testament to the power of ideological commitment. The delayed Soviet recognition of Sorge, 20 years after his death, came only after Stalin's death and Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalinist excesses. In 1964, the USSR finally acknowledged Richard Sorge as a Soviet intelligence officer and posthumously awarded him Hero of the Soviet Union. Streets were named after him. Monuments were erected. His face appeared on Soviet postage stamps. But this recognition came with careful omissions. Official accounts emphasized Sorge's intelligence about Japanese intentions while mentioning his warnings about German invasion only briefly, without dwelling on the fact that these warnings had been ignored. Full disclosure of the intelligence disaster never occurred even in the post-Soviet era. The narrative of Soviet victory over Nazi Germany remains central to Russian national identity, and dwelling on catastrophic failures at the war's beginning complicates that narrative. The mathematical certainty that German intelligence officers discovered and captured American supplied documents parallels the documentary certainty that Soviet intelligence provided about German invasion plans. In both cases, evidence that should have informed strategic decision-making was dismissed because it contradicted what leaders wanted to believe. Hitler refused to accept that arithmetic made German victory impossible. Stalin refused to accept that Hitler would break the Nazi-Soviet pact. Both men chose comfortable falsehoods over uncomfortable truths. The cost of these choices, millions of deaths, years of war, civilizations devastated, stands as perhaps history's clearest demonstration that reality cannot be negotiated with or wished away. Wars between industrial powers are decided by production capacity regardless of ideological fervor. Nations that ignore warnings of impending attack suffer catastrophic defeats regardless of diplomatic agreements. Arithmetic and evidence always win eventually, though the interim cost of denying them can be staggering. Richard Sorge's 84 warnings about Operation Barbarossa represent the gold standard of intelligence reporting: accurate, timely, specific, from proven sources, corroborated by multiple independent channels. If this intelligence could not prevent catastrophe, what intelligence ever could? The answer may be that intelligence alone never prevents anything. Intelligence provides information. Prevention requires leaders willing to act on information even when doing so contradicts their preferences, challenges their assumptions, or forces them to admit previous judgments were wrong. The story's final irony is that Sorge's intelligence about Japanese intentions, which Stalin believed, proved as strategically important as his warnings about German invasion that Stalin ignored. The Siberian divisions transferred west because Sorge confirmed Japan would not attack saved Moscow and possibly the entire Soviet war effort. So Sorge's intelligence did help win the war, just not in the way he intended or in time to prevent the initial catastrophe his ignored warnings might have averted. In the end, Richard Sorge accomplished what every intelligence officer aspires to achieve. He provided decision-makers with accurate information about enemy plans in time to act. That his information was ignored represents not his failure but his nation's failure. The tragedy is not that the intelligence was imperfect but that perfect intelligence made no difference. Sorge gave Stalin the truth. Stalin chose to believe a lie. And millions died because reality cannot be negotiated with, only accepted or suffered. The mathematics of industrial warfare, the documentary evidence of invasion plans, both represent the same fundamental truth. In modern warfare between industrial nations, reality is objective, measurable, and indifferent to ideology or wishful thinking. Leaders who accept reality have advantages. Leaders who deny reality pay catastrophic prices. And the price is always paid not by the leaders themselves but by the millions who serve them, trust them, and die because of their failures.